History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, a very snowy nation's capital. This sort of day where you just want to sit around and read a book. And we have a recommendation for a great new book that you can pick up. It's just out, and we have the author of that book with us from what I'm assuming is a not-so-snowy Vancouver, British Columbia. Brian Payton, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. No, it's not raining, so that's a good day for us. But there's no snow on the ground and no frost. Sorry to say to you.
Okay, we like it, I guess, for a short period of time. The book is called The Wind is Not a River, and it looks at a little-known part of the Second World War, which is the Japanese occupation of the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. So first of all, just where does this idea come from to write about such a little-known part of the Second World War?
Well, before I moved to British Columbia, I moved to BC when I was 16, and I've lived here ever since. But before that, I lived in Anchorage, Alaska. And I lived there from the ages of 13 to 16, and I became aware of this history as a young teenager living up there. And I thought, my God, how come people throughout the rest of North America have no idea about this? And Alaskans are aware of it, sort of broad brush details, but no one else seemed to be. And so even then I thought, well, this would be a great, great backdrop for a novel. And then started reading the history of it in my early 20s. I started picking up what history was available. And the nonfiction accounts of the war have been done. And there's some excellent histories that people should look at. One of them would be The 1,000-Mile War by Brian Garfield. That's a fantastic sort of omnibus of the war in Alaska, which includes the war in the Aleutian Islands. So the nonfiction history of the war had been done, but as I searched around, I could find very little in the way of fiction. And what fiction there was not widely known or widely read. And I thought, well, this would make, again, a great novel. And I got serious about doing research on this after my first novel came out, which was called The Hail Mary Corner. And I updated my knowledge by that time and looked at what else had been written, which wasn't much. And I thought, okay, at this stage, I need to go to the Aleutian Islands. And so I traveled up there in 2002 and went out as far as I could go into the Aleutian Archipelago. And the Aleutian Archipelago is a chain of islands, a 1,100-mile-long chain of islands that sweeps out from the Alaskan mainland and then arcs most of the way over towards Siberia. These islands separate the North Pacific from the Bering Sea, and it is an extreme place to visit. And so I spent some time out on the land there and in the community with the people, and began my sort of on-the-ground research. Came back convinced that this would make a great setting for a novel, and started to write. I began to write the first draft of The Wind is Not a River in 2002. As you say, I also write nonfiction, and other projects came to the fore for me, and I had to set the novel aside a couple of times. But I kept coming back to it, and I made a real concerted rewrite in 2011, and I thought, okay, this is it. After all these years, I've been carrying the story with me for a long time now. I'm gonna take it across the finish line here, and I finally did it in 2011.
Like you say, you've written nonfiction stuff as well, and the two most recent ones are The Ice Passage, which looks at the journey to find Sir John Franklin's lost ships, and Shadow of the Bear, which was also published in Bear Country, the title In Bear Country in the UK, and that documented your travels around to find the 8 remaining bear species. So, but those are nonfiction books. I mean, how do you make that decision for something that you've done a lot of research on? You're familiar with nonfiction. Why go back to fiction to tell this story?
Well, I believe that there are certain stories that fiction can tell that nonfiction can't, having done and do both. I think when we reach back for the great novels of World War I, World War II, and now even the Vietnam War, I think that as a society, we do look at fiction and reach for fiction to help make sense of or give meaning to some of these events, or in fact face the meaningless of some of these events. And I think that fiction helps us do that much better than nonfiction. So that's the main reason. The second reason is, the nonfiction accounts had already been done, and they're out there for people to look at, but no one knows to look for them. because they don't know the history of this war. And so I became intrigued by that question. Why don't people know about this? And that led to the realization that, well, the journalists were kicked out. They were rounded up and sent out of Alaska Territory, and that battle was prosecuted beyond view of the civilian the civilian press. And so right away I had a character, and that character was a journalist who actually made it back to Alaska and evaded the censors and got behind enemy lines to sort of see what was happening. And so right away I had a character who could take us into the places that the journalists weren't able to go.
Well, I guess my follow-up to that is, for as much as the nonfiction accounts may exist, it's still a lost war, or a lost aspect of the war. Mm-hmm. And I guess the historian part of me sort of gets my hackles up and saying, no, maybe the most effective way to do this is through nonfiction and to shine this light on it. Or is it the answer of the best way to shine the light on it is through fiction, because maybe more people would access it through this story as opposed to reading a more narrative account?
I think that the history and the publishing record proves that to be correct. People reach for fiction about World War II, and then oftentimes they become intrigued by the stories they learn there, and then they go back and they buy the nonfiction. They buy the journals of people who actually served there. They buy the military histories and get into the details of that. So that's one reason. The other reason is, this book is set during World War II in Alaska. I wanted to shine a light into a hidden corner of history. But the novel is much more than that. This is a novel of physical and existential survival, and in the end it becomes a love story. So it tells us something about what it is like to be alive in that time in Alaska during the war, and it tells us a bigger story of what it's like to try to face life without your loved ones and with the loss of your loved ones. So it's much more than I would be able to bring to it in a nonfiction standpoint.
And one of the things I read about this book in one of the reviews, and I think it was a quote from you, that you said it was a book about war without war. Like, it's not about battles and that kind of stuff. It takes place in the war, but like you said, it's a story of survival. Just wondering then, how do you cast the contrast? If people are approaching this as a book about the Second World War, and if that's how they're coming to it, they're going to be really surprised as to what they actually get.
Yeah, I think that was something Mark Medley said at the National Post, and he's in reality, yes, much of the battle takes place off stage, but battle most certainly does inform the waking life pretty much every day of the main character, John Easley, and it springs to life in a very violent way in the last quarter of the novel. What this book is not, and what I had sort of imagined it would probably be at the beginning, is a series of descriptions of battle. I quickly lost interest in trying to relay that story of the story of the soldiers on the ground, because, as I said, some great nonfiction has been done about that. I wanted to tell a new and different story, and that's about somebody who wasn't a soldier, and to shine the light on the journalists who went out to some extent to bring the story home and weren't able to. So World War II is about military people and about battles and actions. It's also about civilians displaced by war. And in this book, we go into some detail about the Aleutian people and experiences of being displaced. And it's also about ordinary people who find themselves sidelined and their lives taken apart by this battle, or by this war that they have no control over.
So the book is basically, the way it's structured is really interesting in that it goes from the main character, John Easley, in these chapters, and then it also looks at his wife, who's back at home in Seattle at the start of the book. And I'm just wondering, how did you come up with that structure of it and deciding to focus initially sort of equally on the two parts of the war, the home front and then the front lines?
Well, as I was describing before, the character of John Easley, the journalist, sort of sprang out right away for me when my research was happening. I knew I had to have this character, and he came almost fully formed to me right away. And I wrote the book, even from the first draft, in a series of alternating chapters, because when I got to the end of that first chapter, and it's a long first chapter, this novel sort of breaks a lot of tradition that way. I take you 30 pages into this. And by the end of that chapter, I had so many questions about John Easley, and I hope the reader does too, that started pointing at a missing part of himself, and that pointed to another person who informed who he was, and that became Helen Easley, and then to a lesser extent became his brother, who lost his life in service over the English Channel. So once I had Helen, I realized, well, who is this woman who would be with John Easley? What makes her tick, and what's her story? And so her story starts back in the lower 48 states in Seattle. And she's told to stay at home and keep the home fires burning, but she does not. She sets out on her own odyssey to find her husband and bring him home. And for a woman to try to attempt something like that in 1943 in wartime is a pretty big job for her to undertake. And so as I started taking her through those paces, I also realized, look, she gets to go to the other parts of the war in Alaska that John can't. John is hemmed in and is fighting for survival on the land. Helen moves across, Washington State into British Columbia and into Alaska and into the Aleutians. She sees the war behind the scenes and gives us that history and that glimpse behind the curtain that he never gets to see.
Now, one of the narratives I think that often gets brought up with the Second World War, and maybe a little bit with the First World War, and people can feel free to correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's that the home front was easy, and I'll put the word easy in quotation marks, is that the men were off fighting, and then women were at home. Yes, they went to the factories, and there was rations and stuff, but it was a comparatively easy situation that they were just at home and living their lives. And I think one of the things that comes across with the character of Helen is that when she's at home, it's not easy, that she's having a very difficult time. And I'm wondering if part of writing that character is addressing this narrative of the home front and what life on the home front truly was like during the Second World War.
You're right. In the end, of course, life on the home front was not easy for anyone in North America. They weren't on the front line. They weren't putting their lives on the line on a daily basis. But of course, it was difficult. One of the temptations, I suppose, with writing about war or any other large narrative events like that, or the Great Depression, is to make statements and to write about the experience of a people as a whole. I think it's a temptation for all writers. I chose not to do that. I chose to write about individuals and stay very close to telling the story of really these two people. And in the end, I hope I did shine some light on that issue, that it was not difficult for her in what becomes a land of missing men. And so, in this hierarchical, patriarchal society that, people were living in at the time, to have that sort of removal of all of that force and all of that authority and all of that knowledge, and have these people women have to fill the vacuum. Of course, that's been written about so much and is important. But I wanted to focus in right down on one person. That was Helen. And what was she going to do in this new world of missing men? How was she going to find her way back to her husband?
And what was the inspiration for her? I mean, you mentioned that it was to, you have this first character of John Easley, and you're trying to round him out and try to understand him. But was there a specific person or a specific event that maybe you were doing in your research that you found that you were basing her off of, or was it just a creation to put in contrast to John?
She's a creation from the word go. You're right about that. But what I found with her right away is that she was an untested person. I think that does reflect the experience of many women during World War II at home. Her life was untested, and she reflects back on her mother's experience in World War I and all of the trials and tribulations she had to go through, and the successes that her mother was able to achieve by her age. And she feels, by comparison, completely shielded and untested. And so, of course, the test has come for everyone at that time during war. How is she going to meet that challenge? Is she going to stay at home, as she's been told by her husband, as she's been told by her father, to stay safe and warm where there is no battle? Or is she going to go and do what her heart tells her, and that is to hopefully find her husband and offer him some assistance? So it's about her finding herself and finding her voice and strength.
Do you think that her having that agency and having that strength speaks to the strength of women on the home front? Again,
I try not to speak for that larger issue. Yeah. I think there's a reflection of that, certainly, and I think that what happened after the war or during the war is that women very quickly filled that vacuum that men had left, and they very ably did that. And after the war, we saw that society was turned, if not upside down, society was shaken to its core because of that experience women had, and that is, they had agency. They were able to do things that men could do, and their lives were expanded dramatically by that event. Helen has found that to be the case for her, and I think she blooms because of it. So keeping it to her story, I think that is true.
Now, Helen is based in Seattle. Helen and John have lived in Seattle. I'm wondering why you chose Seattle for them to live, because I don't think Seattle's ever been picked as a representative city of the country. It's usually somewhere in the middle of the country, sort of that homeland sort of feel. So I'm just wondering why Seattle, and is there significance to picking Seattle?
That's a great question. Well, this story is a story of on the margins of World War II, and I wanted to not have sort of the archetypical home front experience. I wanted to have something different, and part of my story is that I was born in the States and moved to Canada when I was 16, and I've lived here ever since. So there's a dual nature in my life as well. I'm an immigrant. And so, I throughout my life, I think about that quite a bit. And I decided to make John a Canadian and make his wife an American. And that's the exact opposite of my married life. My wife is a Canadian, and I'm originally from the States. And I thought that, I could explore some ideas of those different approaches and different sensibilities. I quickly lost interest in that as a theme in the book. And I thought, well, why not Seattle? Why not Vancouver? British Columbia played a big role in the war in Alaska. People, don't connect the Alaska-Canada Highway, the 1,700-mile road that was punched through the wilderness in not even 2 years to forestall the possibility of an invasion from Japan. So BC and Alaska, which border each other, are very much bound up in what happened up there, as is Seattle. Seattle is the traditional entrepot for Alaska. Anything that goes to Alaska stops in Seattle first. And so these things naturally tie together. And it's a funny question because I thought, okay, my American editors are going to go, why is this guy a Canadian and why is he from Vancouver? They never once asked the question. It's just who he is, and that's where he's from.
And I don't know. The other part of me, I mean, the part of me that doesn't really think all that critically about things is that, well, of course they live in Seattle, because otherwise, to get to Seattle, they have to either fly out to the West Coast or do something. I mean, it just makes it easier for them to be from Seattle to go up to Alaska. And maybe too, why would somebody from, and maybe this speaks to why this stuff gets lost in the history, is why would somebody from New York care what's going on in Alaska?
Absolutely.
Right?
People in Seattle do. People in Vancouver will. If you're in Vancouver in 1943 and you hear that the Japanese are starting to gobble up islands in Alaska, you're going to prick up your ears and you're going to be very concerned.
Yes. Yeah, it's a little closer to home. Talking about Helen a little bit, I want to talk about the John part of the story as well. So, that first chapter that you mentioned, I don't want to give away too much, but he gets shot down and he's on one of these islands up in Alaska. And as you say, it's a story of survival. Now, you mentioned that you did some research by going up to the islands. What was that experience like, and what were you looking for when you went?
It was a very difficult journey to get there. You have to fly. I had to go to Seattle to go south of Seattle, north to Anchorage, and then from Anchorage to Dutch Harbor, which is on Alaska Island. And that is the center of a major ship, fishing fleet is based out of there, but it's a very small community and a very rough community. And then from there, I went as far as I could on the Aleutian chain where there still is a community, where there's still habitation, and that is Atka Island, which is about halfway down the chain. And I went there to capture the details that I bring with the sensibility that I bring with me to my nonfiction projects, and that is I need to, walk the landscape. I need to breathe in the air. I need to see what the environment looks like and feels like. I need to poke around, and I need to observe that ecosystem. And so I spent time out on the land alone. And I spent time in the community talking to the folks who live there, very small community of Aleut people who live on Atka, because I wanted to bring some of those visceral details and tangible quality to my writing that I try to bring to my nonfiction.
And what was the reaction of the people up there?
Well, I was a bit of a curiosity. As you can imagine. At the time, there were about 80 people living there. And they don't get visitors unless they're there to do a job, like a teacher comes in or a nurse comes in. So I ended up staying, and there's nowhere to stay, right? So I ended up staying in a worker's cabin. There were two men who were there to work on a water filtration system at the time. I bunked with them, and then we'd go in and spend time in the village every day. They were shy, cautious, but generous once they saw that I was going to be there for a while and I'm going to be walking their road every day and talking to them. And generous with their time and stories, but also circumspect, because they've seen white guys coming to their community for almost 300 years with some plan, some idea, some reason, something to, I don't know, some story to tell them. And so they kind of look at you with that face, like, okay, what are you going to try to tell me here? What's this all about? And then after a while, I got to know them, and they were great. So I really enjoyed my time there.
Did they help you with learning about how to survive on in that situation or in that type of place? Because there's a lot of description about how John survives. Were they instrumental in helping you learn how they live, or even traditional methods of living on that land?
Yes, they were, and the traditional methods of living and harvesting food, bore very little resemblance to what John ends up doing, because they, like us, live in fairly modern homes, and they go out there boat and fish, and they live a life that would be not unrecognizable to First Nations people across Canada. What John is doing is something they would never do, and that is living out in the wet and cold in a cave. And so I ended up having to invent so much of what he was going through just from having been there myself and imagining what it would be like, and then reaching for what's next. What is available to eat at this time of day? Where could I go to find some protein? And so start asking those questions leads you further down the beach.
And fog is a major theme through the story too. Was there a lot of fog?
Oh yeah.
It was interesting to me to read about it, because it's almost like, maybe I'm searching for symbolism here, but there's like this cover that comes with it, similar to this cover that's sort of over the whole story of the Japanese on the Aleutian Mountains. And I guess that leads into a larger question of, how do you write something that in theory isn't that exciting, of a guy trying to survive on an island? How do you write that in a way that is appealing to a reader? And to me, the fog is something that I kept coming back to when I was reading it. Is something that sort of struck me as being really interesting, as a method that you were using to further the story and make these allusions to other things. And is that difficult to do in such, or what could be a very static setting?
Yes, the fog is a physical reality that has to be dealt with. And in the end, the fog and the wind are John's only means of protection and his most lethal enemies. And so there's the duality there, where he needs the cover of fog to get done what he needs to do and to keep himself concealed, as he does, the wind and weather. But it's also what, in the end, could cost his life. And so I liked the duality of that, and it fit nicely into what was going on with his story, and in the end, the overall story of what's happening in Alaska. And when people, do seek out, and I hope they do, the nonfiction accounts of what happened in Alaska, they quickly realized that, most of the casualties on the American side were due to weather-related issues. These men were fighting the elements as much or more than they were fighting the Japanese. And so I felt that was important to bring in the story. The question about having him in one place for most of the novel and ending up in a cave, I love those kinds of stories personally. I love the Jack London stories of trying to survive on the land, and I find them absolutely compelling. So that's the kind of story that draws me. But also as a writer, I wanted to make it, I wanted to raise the stakes, because so oftentimes with a novel about war, they go right into the heart of battle and you're there all the time. And so in some ways, it's easier to keep that dramatic tension higher when you're being shot at every second, right?
Right.
And you have characters to play off of all the time, and the conversations and the camaraderie. Well, as readers will find out very soon, John easily finds himself alone on the land. And so it's a more difficult task you set for yourself as a writer. But I find a more interesting one, because in the end, it becomes a physical and existential survival story, which I find a more compelling experience.
Now, in writing this story, though, there are some things that are unpleasant, let's say. There's more than a few moments where I was cringing as I was reading. And how do you... I realize that it's a necessity in this type of story to write about things that maybe people don't necessarily... probably wouldn't seek out on their own. But within this context, it's necessary. How do you write about those things? And are you concerned about maybe losing readers along the way when you're writing about something that isn't particularly pleasant?
No, I'm not concerned about losing readers because I can think of probably 3 or 4 of the scenes you're probably alluding to. And if they've come that far with me in the novel, I take it on faith they're going to go through those scenes with me and come out the other side and have felt something. For me, the best reading experiences are reading experiences where I learn something, where I'm challenged to rethink something, and then when I feel something. And if a story can deliver on all those levels for me, I find it very successful. And I think that those scenes that are difficult to read, if someone closes the book because it's difficult, they'll find other readers.
Yeah, and I mean, and I don't want it to sound like I think that you're sensationalizing it, because I don't think it is. I think it's just part of what that situation would be like. Obviously, I've never been in that situation, but it all felt real. But it also felt unpleasant. And I guess the reality of the situation is that it's an unpleasant situation. So to reflect that, they have to be included.
It's a life and death story, and that also calls for some decisions that will call into question your humanity sometimes. And what are you willing to do to survive? What are you willing to do to honor a lost loved one? Right. What are you willing to do to reconnect with love? And so John has to face some of those unpleasant questions.
But as you're writing it, do you ever think of, are you ever maybe self-censoring yourself, or are you maybe using language or changing words to maybe address that? Or is it you're just writing purely based on how it feels or what feels right?
I'm a believer in just writing from the heart and the head. And if I'm self-censoring at that level, I think we would have an unreadable novel. I think I have to go to the dark places. I think I have to go to the difficult places and find what's there. And that's the kind of character John Easley is. And with this book, I hope that's the kind of writer I am. I don't want to shy away from difficult situations, thoughts, or experiences in the book.
Yeah, and it's something that I tell students a lot too, is that when I taught a course, I stand up at the first day and I say, there's going to be stuff that's not pleasant here. And I'm going to use language that I don't use in my normal life. And I'm going to show you clips of stuff where there's going to be stuff in readings that's not going to be nice, because that's just a reflection of what it is. And is it possible then, like, my feeling is that you can't really learn without challenging yourself or dealing with these issues that aren't pleasant. And because that's just the way the world is. It's not necessarily the nicest place in the world. And if we try to whitewash everything, then really what are we doing? And is there use to studying the past?
Exactly, I agree.
So within this context, though, there's this unpleasantness or these things that are going on with John, and yet you manage to weave in a love story, and it doesn't seem out of place. And I'm just wondering, how did you manage to work these two elements that are so divergent into one cohesive story?
Well, I was really surprised by that love story part. I certainly did not set out to write that, and it sort of grew organically, as they say, out of the story, and I was taken by surprise by what was happening. How did I do that organic? Well, as I said before, I wrote it alternating chapters from the beginning. So I was discovering who Helen was and what her mission in life was and what made her tick, as the reader does. And so if it's woven into the narrative in a way that seems natural, it's because I discovered it naturally. It wasn't something I thought after I wrote the first draft, hey, this needs a woman love story. That would be ridiculous. So she organically came out of that. And, it's a very non-traditional love story in so many ways, because they have so few pages together in the book. And it's a story of loss and longing as much as it is love. But it's about what happens to us in the absence of love, and who we are in the presence of love and who we are in the absence of love. And so in that sense, it definitely is a love story.
Were you worried about it? Because you said you didn't set out to write a love story. Were you worried about having a love story in a book about the Second World War? And I'm asking this in the context of movies that have done this and have gotten harshly criticized for taking the war and turning it into a love story. I mean, was that something you were worried about as it was developing as a love story?
I certainly don't think about critics when I'm writing. I can honestly tell you that. And so, as I was saying in another interview, to me, nonfiction is more like a chess game. You're on that board and you have to make certain moves within the limits that you have. And this is more like playing with a Ouija board. And am I going to let this go where it naturally goes, or am I not? And so you have to ask yourself that question quite early in the writing process. And so I allowed these characters to come out and to surprise me and to come alive and assert their hopes and fears and dreams in ways that surprised me and confounded me sometimes, because I feel it's a natural way to write fiction. So, I don't think, for example, Michael Ondaatje was too worried about having a love story in The English Patient, for example, and I don't think that Charles Fraser was too worried about having a love story in Cold Mountain. It's just, this is how the story came alive to him, to those writers.
So we've talked about that you have your fiction books, your nonfiction books. I'm wondering, what's the biggest difference to you in writing fiction compared to nonfiction?
For me, I arrive at any of these projects, fiction or nonfiction, with a similar toolbox. It depends on which tools you reach for at which time in the story. With fiction, the gloves are off. You can make up things you need to and are forced to make up things, and to invent. And invention is such a powerful and wonderful creative outlet and an art form that I really enjoy doing. With my nonfiction, I have a very orthodox approach, and that is, if I write a scene that has somebody telling me something in a certain place, you can take it to the bank that person told me that in that place as described, from my point of view, of course. Mm-hmm. So I don't have the problems that some people seem to have, conflating fiction and nonfiction or blurring the lines. So I like them both for different reasons. Nonfiction gets me out into the world. I've been able to travel the world to write these books and write these magazine articles, meeting new people, having new experiences, being forced to think in new and different ways. Fiction is a different way of seeing the world. It's a very inward one. You come home and you look deep inside to do these things. So they're just different ways of using those same tools.
Is there one that you find, in the context of writing about the past, that lends itself more to writing about the past, or does it just depend on the story that you want to tell?
I think it depends on the story you want to tell. And I honestly love both, and I really admire writers who are able to do both throughout their careers, and I've always hoped to fashion a career that way, because I think I get something different out of the two different art forms. And
I guess just finally, how would you frame yourself then? I realize as an author writing fiction, but would you cast yourself as a historian, or would you say that you're... No?
I have too much respect for historians.
Okay. All right. Well, then just where does that interest from the past come from then?
I always say to aspiring writers, they ask, how do you do what you do, and what's your sort of, how do you go through the world as a writer? And I think I follow my interests, and that's always been all I've done throughout my career as a writer. I become interested in natural history. I write about natural history and learn about natural history. I become interested in politics around conservation. I write about those issues. I become interested in certain aspects of history, like with the ice passage. And I study that history, and I inhabit that history. And then with The Wind is Not a River, my interest kept taking me back to the Aleutian Islands. And so I think it's a wonderful way to live life, indulging your interests. And I realize that it's a rare pleasure for people. But no, I'm not a historian. I just follow my interests, and hopefully they lead to a good story. It's as simple as that.
Well, I think that in this case it has definitely led to a really good story. And the book is The Wind is Not a River by Brian Payton, Payton, Payton. If you're looking on Google or on Amazon, whatever, you can find the book there. Find him on Twitter @BAPayton, BrianPayton.com. You can find all your information there about not just this book, but all his past books and all the terrific stuff that you've written so far. So, Brian, thanks so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
If anybody has any questions, comments for the podcast, historyslam@gmail.com, Twitter @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out, you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.